Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're doing very well tonight. I would like to talk about a list with you that I hope will be as heartwarming to you as it is to me. This is a top 8 challenge list from last week by Pilot I Have the Fire, and it is a classical Abzan Midrange list in structure. However, it does avail itself of new MH2 technology as well, a lovely synthesis of the old and the new. I think we can learn about the list, a lot about the list itself by breaking it down here for you. I think these lessons will also translate into other deck building endeavors, especially as they pertain to classic BGX midrange decks. There's a lot to learn here. I really think the list is delightfully structured. Abzan, for those who don't know, was actually my gateway drug into BG the Rock, which in turn became my main reason to start up the channel. I played Abzan casually for about a year before I even cut white and picked up a 2-color BG deck. Right when I was brand new to Modern, basically, is when I was doing the Abzan thing, so I do love to see it, and it is absolutely unique, because if you look at this list from I Have the Fire, similar decks, related decks on MTG Goldfish, they're not actually that similar at all. We are looking at Gruul, Naya, Sultai, Grixis. None of these are actual Abzan lists. There are no other Abzan lists except an 0-2 one on this entire page, and I did a couple other, card searches, and it doesn't look like there are any Abzan results at all, basically, besides this one, at least in the last month or more, and indeed, Abzan results have been very few and far between in the past couple of years. All the more reason to take a look at this one, and all the more reason to get excited about this one. So shout out to the Pilot. Once again, I Have the Fire for a 5-2 finish, which was good enough to get 8th place in a recent Modern challenge. Really good stuff. Thank you in advance for watching. Let's talk about why this list is so well designed and what there is to learn from it. Alright friends, so I'm just going to go left to right line by line, and I'm going to really stop to focus where we need to stop and focus and really elaborate. So we have 3 copies of Blooming Marsh, notably not playing the 4th. I think omitting the 4th makes a lot of sense in a 3-color deck, especially one that does want the 4th land, the 5th land often to come in untapped, right? And you can get away with doing that if the rest of your land base looks like this, and it's not too greedy with utility lands. We've got 8 fetch lands, 4 flats, 4 catacombs, 4 basic lands, of course the traditional 2 swamp, 1 forest, 1 plains, nothing wrong with that, but in the second column we see a dedication to consistency, 5 traditional shock lands, and a 6th fetchable in the form of Indatha Triome. So we have excellent mana fixing from the land base alone. And as far as utility goes, as I say, they're not too greedy here with a Triome for cycling and a Castle Lochthwain for draw, both kind of flood insurance. We are not playing any peat lands or any other canopy lands. That is probably the most notable exclusion from the land base, but note that we're only on 22 lands overall, which is a little bit low in the context of Abzan, but that I think is a perfectly fine number when we realize that we're playing Ignoble Hierarch, which of course an additional mana source, an additional source of fixing. So between the Hierarch and the 22 lands and the composition of those 22 lands, we have a very, very safe land base. And this is actually a little bit of a countervailing wind to the recent trends of a lot of mid-range lists that I've happened to see, doing 5-0s and whatever else. They are a little bit greedy with their land base in multiple different ways. This is an example of how to build a really safe, really effective, really consistent land base. I do love it. Now, let's focus on Ignoble Hierarch here. Many people are skeptical that this would be a good mid-range card because it is a bad top deck, and that is basically the long and short of it. We don't historically play mana dorks, with the notable exception of Deathrite Shaman, right? But I would say, as a counter-argument, that Deathrite Shaman's existence actually proves that there is a mana dork that is sufficiently powerful to see play in mid-range. Obviously, Iggy is no DRS, but we see this card doing a ton of work here, even though it does not offer perfect fixing. We don't really use the red, and we don't really get any white from Ignoble Hierarch. That said, Dauthi Voidwalker demands BB on turn 2. Iggy can help facilitate that. Torok demands triple black by turn 3 if you're powering it out, or by turn 4 if you haven't made the third land drop, for example, but you still have an Ignoble Hierarch unchecked. These are some pretty significant color demands, and Ignoble Hierarch is certainly helping us there. The colors beyond that, as far as the color demands go, not that severe, and I think that's another example of a relatively safe build. We're not pushing the envelope with white at all, right? The only double white requirement in the entire deck is for Timeless Dragon, which itself will, as often, if not more often than not, get you a white source itself rather than be like hard cast for 5 in the late game. And we do have enough white sources to consistently hard cast that in the late game, should we need to. Of course, eternalizing after getting a plains with plane cycling is an option too. You're kind of fixing your own mana that way if it already wasn't good enough. Otherwise, every white card just has one white pip, and that is a beautiful thing. Ignoble Hierarch, though, doing so much more than fixing in this deck. The ramp is so nice in the context of Abzan specifically. Why is that? Well, it's because Abzan has a critical mass of 3-drop effects that are very powerful, and anybody who's tried to brew like Dead Gael or Abzan Midrange, you have more 3-drops than you can realistically support almost all of the time, almost no matter what else you're trying to do. Ignoble Hierarch allowing you to be a little bit heavier on the 3-drop slot of the curve, and specifically, we have a lot of really desirable planeswalkers there right now. Turn 2 Liliana of the Veil, obviously going to be a knockout in a lot of situations. Turn 2 Grist. I am not that high on Grist in BGX, but if there was a shell in which I think Grist is very good, it would be this one, because the prospect of turn 2, take up, make an insect, very nice. The prospect of sacrificing something to kill an opposing threat and leave a planeswalker behind that can take over the game, that is also very nice in this shell in particular. Most BGX midrange decks don't play a great many expendable bodies, right? But we are on Lingering Souls. We are on, the Grist insects if you've been fortunate enough to be in control of the game enough to take up first. And of course, Ignoble Hierarch itself, a relatively expendable body, and not because it's bad, but because we only invested 1 mana into it. It perhaps helped accelerate us out, so we're basically trading card advantage for tempo at that point, and if the Grist can stick around, we'll recoup the card advantage in a kind of indirect way. So Grist is a very good fit in this shell, in no small part thanks to Ignoble Hierarch. And of course, we've got Kaya Orzhov Usurper and Ashiok Dreamrender, 2 cards that get way better, that are also planeswalkers on turn 2 than they would be on T3. That can be the difference between these cards totally taking over the game, or totally locking your opponent out, and them just being a little bit too slow to matter. Other notable use cases for Iggy here, besides generically just like making sure you have enough mana to operate, powering out Turok on turn 3, powering out a hardcast Force of Vigor on turn 3, which is very powerful in a whole lot of situations, not only giving you the 4th mana, but also the 2nd green, providing both fixing and ramp. And if we need to free cast Force, if we need to 2-for-2 the opponent rather than 2-for-1 them, Ignoble Hierarch gives you probably just enough green sources to really justify having this card in the deck rather than some other form of artifact hate, because without Ignoble Hierarch, we would be a little bit light on green, and Force of Vigor might not even be a good fit at all. I realize I just spent a whole lot of time talking about Ignoble Hierarch and how it makes a lot of cards better. I think that's one of the most important things to understand about this list, though, so that's why we belabor that point. But moving on, Prismatic Ending, this is one of the very best removal spells in Modern. It just entered the format. It's an uncommon. Do not underestimate it. It is completely incredible, very flexible. A lot of people have even been kind of hounding me in some of my 2-color lists that I've featured that are, for example, my recent Dead Gaia list. Should we be playing Prismatic Ending? I don't know. I don't know if it's good enough in a 2-color deck to necessarily displace really proven technology like Fatal Push. I'm not against it, I just haven't had enough experience to really say for sure. What I can say for sure is that in these 3-color lists, it is absolutely a huge attraction. Now, people might say, well, Abzan already had really good removal. You know what? Nothing like Prismatic Ending, nothing that is as mid-rangey as Prismatic Ending. Note that we do not have Trophy, Decay, or Pulse. Normally, that would be heresy to me in an Abzan shell. One of the biggest incentives to kind of throwing all these cards, all these colors together, is to avail yourself of that type of catch-all removal. But in a 3-color deck with a lot of fetchables that really power up Prismatic Ending, and once again, Ignoble Hierarch helping to power up Ending, I guess in that way we could actually use the red mana, now that I come to think of it. Prismatic Ending becomes really premier removal. That's why we have 3 main deck, a 4th copy in the side. This is a big incentive to play Abzan. If you're looking at this list so far and saying, I get it, but is white really better than red or than staying 2-color? Prismatic Ending presents a very strong attraction to white, make no mistake. But we're not relying only on that, of course. We've still got 3 Fatal Push, 3 Inquisition, 3 Thoughtseize. We love all of that stuff. And then, if we're looking at what differentiates this from, for example, Dead Guy Ill, we already mentioned Ignoble Hierarch, we already mentioned the 3rd and perhaps even 4th color making Ending good, but we also have Tarmogoyf, and make no mistake, turn 2 Goyf is still what we want to do in a lot of matchups. Maybe not in as many matchups as we once did, and maybe we don't do turn 2 Tarmogoyf quite as well as Rock or Jund, but this is still a big part, I'm sure, of how this deck got over the line to the 5-0. We've got 2 top copies of Dothy Voidwalker as well. I've talked a lot about this card. I don't think it does anything here that it doesn't necessarily do in other shells, right? But it is definitely a nice supplementary threat. Allows you to attack the opponent on some very interesting axes. What I'd really like to focus on, though, are the 1-ofs, the Scavenging Ooze in the Torok here at the 2-drop slot, because while it might be more impressive to go turn 1 Iggy into turn 2 Grist or Liliana or Vindicate, we still have to have a lot of cards that are good, no matter whether we're curving out optimally or whether we're stumbling a little bit through a mulligan or through opposing disruptions. Scavenging Ooze and Torok fit those bills in very different ways, but in the way that is kind of congruent with how we need to build BGX. These cards are flexible, and they are also mana sinks, and we've talked about Torok. Iggy also enables Scavenging Ooze, just giving you that 1 extra activation in that crucial turn 3, turn 4 when you're really stabilizing. Of course, we're fixing with green mana from Iggy for the Skoos as well. And just as a general deck building consideration, I have advised for a very long time, because I just sometimes I put 1-ofs in my deck like this, sometimes I don't. But I've noticed that the general population has an aversion to 1-ofs unless they're tutor targets or something. But if you're in a mid-range deck with no selection, people don't usually play 1-ofs. I would encourage you to do so. A classic question people used to ask me was, do I play 2 Skoos or 2 Bob in this rock shell? And I would say, consider 1 of each, because they are not a liability if you only draw 1. It's when you start drawing multiples and they represent the wrong half of the deck that you really start regretting your life decisions. So 1 Skoos, 1 Torok, same type of energy here. But moving on, damn, this card is incredible. I love the card, damn. I think it is so good, and it's once again an attraction to playing black and white to the white splash, right? Because we have obviously 1-for-1 removal when that's the game we need to play, or when we don't have the luxury of sweeping because it's too early and there's a must answer on the board. But when we fall behind, this 1-for-1 removal can be a catch-up card. The flexibility in the form of removal, allowing us to main deck a Wrath effect, is completely off the charts, and that's yet another thing Iggy does. We can power out a turn 3 Dam, Iggy heroically sacrificing himself in order to Wrath the board, start over, we've got a full grip, opponent's probably playing off the top of their deck. We talked about how good Lily and Grist would be, turn 2 off of Iggy, but of course these are very respectable cards in any context, basically, as far as Liliana goes, and in the context of this shell in particular, with, again, more expendables than you usually see in BGX for Grist. So whether we're ramping them out ahead of curve or whether we're playing them the fairway on turn 3, we've got a lot of X for 1 potential, a lot of grinding power with those two cards. And then here at the top end, we've got even more grinding power. Lingering Souls, of course, is a stalwart, a near ever-present and Abzan list. It is really nice to see Grist giving us a major reason to play Lingering Souls here, and also Timeless Dragon kind of doing a little bit of everything here. It looks like a bit of a weird fit in the, maybe at first glance, but you can do a few different things with this. It's a 2-mana instant speed tutor up a plane, so maybe you pass holding up removal. If you don't necessarily need your removal, or if it's more optimal to go get a land, you go get a land. Maybe you can use it to force your third land drop through. You don't draw it naturally on turn 3. Well, you just main phase the cycle. Go get a Godless Shrine, Inquisition the opponent. That's a pretty good turn, especially because later in the game you can eternalize the dragon, get it back, make a free 4/4 basically. And this, of course, synergizes with Grist. It synergizes with Liliana. You name it. And also, it's not a bad top deck, is it? If you're late in the game, you've got those 5 lands, just play a 5/5 flyer. We lack big bodies outside of Tarmogoyf or maybe a very fed Scavenging Ooze. Timeless Dragon is just a 5/5, no matter what else happens. If it's hard cast and hits the battlefield with flying, that is pretty darn good. And by the way, one of my favorite things about this list is Vindicate. I have played with Vindicate, dabbled in a few different shells. I always thought it would rock. I always thought it would junk. It's even been a little bit better, a little bit more impressive, a little bit less clunky than I had expected. And I was high on the card, right? So this is another thing you can do that's really nice with Iggy, especially if you're on a land destruction plan with Vindicate. The turn 2 Vindicate is breaking up Tron very nicely, but in general, it's just your catch-all. It's another reason alongside Prismatic Ending we don't necessarily need to see old favorites like Decay, Trophy, or Pulse, although their absence does make me a little bit sad. So in the sideboard, we already kind of talked about Force of Vigor, Prismatic Ending. I love having access to both of these cards. They feel great right now. We also have 2 copies of Kataki's War's Wage, which notably is pretty much asymmetrical in here because we're not playing Stoneforge Mystic and we're not playing Lurrus for Mishra's Bauble. To that end, this could also be Stony Silence, as you prefer, whatever you think is better, whatever you think is better equipped to dodge opposing removal, etc., etc. But either way, the freedom to play your best in slot artifact hate in the color white in the context of a BGX deck and to have it be almost completely asymmetrical is very, very nice. We've got a lot to like in the sideboard as far as these gold cards go as well. We've got the 4th Vindicate. One thing, just to zoom back out and look at the generic deck building, we've got a lot of 3-ofs in the main deck, or maybe not a lot, but enough for me to notice. 3 Push, 3 Inquisition, 3 Thoughtseize, 3 Vindicate, and 3 Prismatic Ending. And for a lot of those cards, we're seeing the 4th copy in the side. You could even see a 4th Fatal Push in the side here very easily if the pilot thought the meta called for that, as an example. And the reason that is so good is because when you put 3 copies in a deck, you're supposed to draw 1 per game on average without much selection, and of course we don't really have any. And that is something that is really good deck building. It's another thing that I've encouraged people to do more in the past. Try 3-ofs rather than 4-ofs or 0-ofs, you know what I mean? A lot of people are like, do I or do not play this card? There's not, apparently to them, a lot of room for the gray areas, and to that I would say a 3-of is a really good fit for a lot of these mid-rangey interactive cards that can be best in class when they line up, can be as bad as totally useless when they don't. But for things that are almost always going to line up, Kaya's Guile, we've got 2 of those in the side, and again, this can come down turn 2 with Iggy, and this could also be main decked, right, because it is so flexible, especially with prowess everywhere. I've found it to be main deckable. There's only so much space, maybe if you like this a little bit over, you could trim a Vindicate, you could trim a Liliana, something like this. It's definitely hard to say, but there could be room to move this main deck. I think it's good enough to be in the sideboard as well. It took me personally a little while to get over the hump of these modal cards being in sideboards, right? My instinct has always been, if they're so modal, if they're good because they're modal, they should probably be main decked, and if they're modal and in the side and deriving a lot of their strength from being modal, maybe we have a better option a more narrow but more powerful option. I've since kind of revised that opinion, and now I'm perfectly happy to see something like Kaya's Guile on the side. We talked about Orzhov Usurper, incredible card, very well positioned right now, especially good in the context of an Iggy shell that can power her out. We talked about Ashiok Dreamrender in the same exact way. If your deck can play this card and you're a mid-range deck, you probably should if Titan is anywhere near the top tables. The supplementary Graveyard Hate and Fetch Hate is actually miles better in the Iggy shell 2 than it is if you have no ability to power this out on turn 2. We've got a second copy of Torok Dreadcanter, same energy as we talked about with, the 3 ofs becoming 4 ofs. This is a 1 of becoming a 2 of. And in a recent Patreon post summing up my experiences thus far with MH2, I said I think there's kind of a soft cap for Torok in most mid-range decks as a 2 of. So we are kind of having the so-called 4th copy, really the 2nd copy, for the context of Torok in the shell. I do love to see that. Torok incredible against white creature decks, and also incredible against control. You'd bring it in against big man in combo too, for sure. Rounding out the sideboard, we have 1 copy of Damping Sphere. Not going to cramp our style all that much in the deck. A good flexible catch-all. I don't know if it's the very best in slot, but I certainly never really hate seeing one. I won't argue with the result here. And then 2 copies of Void Mirror, because those Cascade opponents are going to be pretty darn tough for us. And if we do run afoul of Tron and Eldrazi Tron, between Void Mirror, between potentially a turn 2 Ashiok to really mess with their maps, between all the artifact hate, in between 4 copies of Vindicate, I think we've got plenty of game, especially because remember, we are green. We're not just dirtling, we're sticking a Goyf early and often as well, and it might even be attacking with Exalted. So shout out once again to I Have the Fire for putting Abzan back on the map after a long time in the wilderness. You do love to see it. I hope you guys enjoyed my breakdown of this list. We're probably already at about 20 minutes by now. I do like to be mindful of keeping these things short enough so that they'll be broadly appealing. As you know, I could talk for a very long time. There's a lot of things I could have mentioned that I didn't hear. That's what the comment section is for. If you want to bring up something that I did not cover here, maybe I've already thought of it, maybe I haven't. Either way, I would love to hear from you. Leave it below. We'll talk a little bit more about this list. If you're on Abzan, you can let me know what you're doing with it lately. Notably, Stoneforge Mystic is not in this list. I don't want to spend much time talking about that for the reasons that I just mentioned, right? But I think Stoneforge does not necessarily benefit as much from Hierarch as almost anything else does. Stoneforge may be rewarding you for just being a little bit more interactive heavy, a little bit more high card quality, and not worrying so much about ramping stuff out. So certainly Abzan Blade is very live. That's not what the opponent opted for here. With the addition of Torok, Voidwalker, Grist, even Timeless Dragon, I don't think Stoneforge Mystic is mandatory, and the result here probably proves that. So thanks again for watching, guys. Let me know what you think about everything you just saw here, and I'll talk to you soon.